Hi chess fans, we're looking at the game between Magnus Carlsen with white and Oluwafemi Balogun with black. Balogun is an FM from Nigeria and the game was played in the World Cup in 2017. So we see here the highest rated player in the world play against an FM with 2250. And let's have a look at the game. After e4, um, Balogun chooses a setup with d6 and g6. Okay, so this is a sort of King's Indian setup, but normally white has played c4 and we enter the King's Indian. But in this position here, white has not yet played c4 and there are several ways to continue now for white. One plan is to play knight c3 and f4, which is the Pirc defense, but Magnus Carlsen played in this position bishop c4. And I like this move a lot because in a way it's a very principled move. White has not played c4 yet, so the c4 square is free for the bishop. The bishop puts pressure on the f7 square, and these two pawns here are on the dark squares, and it would be very disharmonious for black to block this bishop with his pawns. So I think it's a very principled move. And the game continued knight f6, attacking the pawn. And Carlsen plays the very aggressive queen e2, protecting the pawn but also threatening now to push the pawn forward. And let's say black plays something like this, then white is already threatening to push the pawn forward, attacking the knight and the pawn. And if the knight moves back, white can play, not immediately, but white is threatening to play the e6 push as well. We will see this in later variations. I guess in this variation, in this particular variation, white would simply be up in development and the advantage would come from there. But the plan is that white can also play e6, attacking the pawn. So we will see this in a later variation. Knight c6, attacking the pawn on d5, knight f3, defending, bishop g7, and castle. So, in this position, what if black would castle? Then white is threatening e5, and after takes and knight d7, we see how powerful this e6 push is and how well it coordinates with the queen and the bishop. So black is already much better here. White is already much better here. The black position is simply collapsing. So that's a big threat. And what can black do against it? If black plays e6, then white can continue putting pressure. This knight is attacked, and if it moves back, white can simply open up black's camp, and this is just some sample variations, but see how strong this attack is. So that's why in this position the theorem move is to play bishop to g4, and the idea is that this knight is pinned and there's some pressure here on the d4 pawn. Okay, so far so good, but white, Carlsen simply played c3, and now this pawn is protected forever, and after castle, h3. Now if the bishop would move back, white again has the e5 move, which coordinates really well with the queen and the bishop again. So let's say knight d7, then again the rook to d1 pins the queen, and it looks very dire. Okay, so that's why black can only deal with this pressure by exchanging the bishop here. So now the queen is not supporting this push anymore, and that pressure is off a little bit. But have a look at this position now. Black has now essentially a King's Indian setup, but the light square bishop has been exchanged. And the light square bishop is very important if black wants to have an attack in the King's Indian. Basically, the King's Indian is about black attacking on the king side and white attacking on the queen side, and the light square bishop stays here on c8 and helps defend the b7 square, but also sacrifices itself. If white pushes too much here on the queen side, black very often sacrifices this bishop to get the lever open on the white position. But without this bishop, black doesn't have this lever, and white's plan can simply be to close the king side, to close down and shut down any attack that black can have on the king side, and push his attack on the queen side. Look, white has only very few pieces here on the queen side. These pieces here on the king side, they have a hard time getting over to the other side, whereas white has space advantage and can coordinate the pieces much quicker, so white's attack is always very strong if black cannot get a strong attack on the other side of the board. And this game is very instructive to see, what happens if black tries to play King's Indian game without the light squared bishop. Okay, black plays e5, and Carlsen played rook to d1. Black brings the queen out of the line with the rook. d5. White is happy to close the bishop here because white's plan is to move the bishop away and push these pawns anyways. So white is actually very happy closing this side of the board because he then has a majority of pieces and a strong attack. Knight to e7. Black brings the knight over while the knight is attacked, but the knight here can also support some f5 push at some point. Queen e2. Making place for the pawns to react flexibly to black setup. Knight h5 with the plan f5. And white plays bishop to b5. That was also an idea behind queen e2. And the point is that, can black play c6 here? Black cannot play c6 because after takes bishop a4, the pawn on d6 is weak. And this pawn is attacked as well. So if the rook comes and protects this pawn, the problem is that this queen is pinned behind the c6 pawn and is super inactive. And if queen to b8, the problem is that at some point the rook could be caged in. And anyway, these two pawns here are weak, so that's why in this position black played queen c8. A logical move, also eyeing to bring the queen over. White develops knight a3, and the knight can go to both c2 and c4. a6 attacking the bishop, and the f4 break. So see, the queen is kind of performing the function of the light squared bishop, but obviously the queen cannot exchange itself and sacrifice itself so easily. Bishop c2, putting some pressure on the f5 pawn and overprotecting the e4 pawn, and black plays f4, a very typical move because black is now maybe planning to move the knight back to f6 and push the pawns. But white played queen g4, a move that's only possible because there's no light square bishop here, offering an exchange of queens. And the point is that without the queen, it's even harder for black to get any attack going on the king side. If the queens are exchanged, white has the space advantage and can use his pieces to push the attack forward. So black exchanged queens here, and then after h takes, knight f6, there is a nice tactical motive here. Let's have a look if you can find it. Point is that white can play g5, attacking the knight, and the knight cannot move back here because white would simply win a pawn. For example, in this variation, in the end white wins this pawn. So as a result, the knight has to move back, and this actually happened in the game. And so this pawn here is blocking all of black's attack. It's very hard for black to get an attack, and already white is much better here, probably because of the space advantage. It's very hard for black to navigate the pieces. The knight c4. Black chose to play b6. Is there any other way that black can play? Well, if knight c5, this knight can simply be pushed back. It has no squares and has to go back. And this has only helped white to push his pawns, so that would have been not good. This knight cannot participate in the party because obviously this square is controlled by white. And if black ever plays b5, actually white can play knight a5, and the knight is very strong here because it cannot be attacked so easily. There's actually no square other than the b7 square where it can be attacked, so it's very safe here. And it controls a lot of important squares. This square here, this square here. It also supports the push of this pawn here. So, for example, after knight b6, white simply denies the knight any square, any entry square here, and white plays king f7 with the idea of bringing the rooks over and getting some attack here going. But white simply plays bishop d3 and pushes the pawns forward, and white gets very active now, very quick, and has a lot of weaknesses to play against. Okay, so that's why black played in this position b6 with the idea of trying to containing white's attack a little bit. If black had played something like king f7, then white could probably simply continue his attack and at some point put pressure on this pawn here. So maybe it would have been a bit better for black to simply play king f7 and just leave the situation here as it is. White doesn't have any direct threat, but it's maybe unclear why b6 contributes to the defense. Because Magnus simply plays b4 and black plays h6, and after takes activates the bishop, but white plays g4 here. This is a little tactical trick, and the point is that after takes, white can simply take the bishop, so black cannot take en passant. And if, for example, bishop moves to g5, white can simply close the position, and black now doesn't have any attack anymore on the king side. Okay, after g4, black played knight f6, and white again closed down the position. Bishop g5, king g2, king g7, attempting to bring the rooks over. But white simply pushes his pawns forward. And now, very interesting, black tries to bring the bishop over here, but white simply makes place for the rooks and moves the rook over to the h5. So after knight to g6, king f1, rook h8, the king moves over to the other side of the board because the rook here by itself can already hold off any attack. The bishop g3, white simply ignores what black is doing and plays a5, coordinating the knight against his pawn, so the pawn has to move forward, and now moving the knight to a3 with the idea of playing the c4 lever. So white attacks very much works with these pawn breaks. This pawn here is fixing this pawn weakness on the c7, so white simply has to use his pawns, move the pawns forward, and then he has the pawn breaks here that coordinate with the pieces. Okay, so black tries to bring the knight over to a more active square, but white has this lever. And after these exchanges, white even has the time to put the bishop on a little bit better square. This is a nice diagonal here. Black can do nothing. White is now controlling the h5. And after takes, this pawn is attacked. And the point is that after rook d8, white can penetrate the position with the knight, and this pawn cannot be protected anymore because the rook cannot come to the protection of the pawn via this square, and can also not come to the protection of the pawn via this square because the knight is controlling these squares. So white can simply bring the bishop over and eat this pawn. For example, after bishop h4, bishop d3, even after these exchanges, in the end white wins the pawn. So in this position, black played rook b8, trying to get some counter attack here on this pawn. But after knight d6, black played king to g6, the point being that if knight takes, white has knight f5. And where can the king go? If the king goes up, the rook comes in, and white wins this pawn here and soon has a deadly attack on the king. And so because of this knight f5 threat, black brought the king over first and in this position resigned. Okay, so that happens if white gives up the light squared bishop. Black gives up the light squared bishop, white can simply close the position on the king side and then pushes attack on the queen side, and this is usually a very easy play for white and very hard to defend for black. And on the other hand, in this position, in the variation with bishop c4 and queen e2, this plan of pushing the pawn basically allows black only to stay in the game by giving up his bishop, by putting some pressure on against the d4 pawn, but this plan doesn't work because c3 is simply protecting it. And again, if the bishop moves back, white has this strong push here, so black has to deflect the queen. But then, as we have seen, the game is very clear for white because without the light squared bishop, white can simply close here and push his pawns there. So very instructive game. Hope you learned a lot. Thanks a lot for watching and see you next time.